Hi, welcome. My name is Samuel Loncar. I'm the editor of the Marginalia Review of Books, and I am delighted to welcome one of the most distinguished Jewish thought leaders and rabbis today, Rabbi David Wolpe, who is the Rabbi Emeritus of the Sinai Temple at Los Angeles and the author of at least 7 books, including a few remarkable ones I hope to discuss today, Why Be Jewish, and this extraordinary biography of David, published by Yale University Press. So we hope to cover some of Rabbi Wolpe's works, but also specifically to get his wisdom on Judaism and the contemporary situation of the world. Thank you so much for being here, Rabbi Wolpe.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I would love to start by asking you, with all of your experience as a teacher and an author and someone who was at Harvard during the recent anti-Semitism crisis, what is your perception of the state of the world today? Not just of Judaism. I'd actually like to get your insight as a religious leader, a kind of religious philosopher, on how do you see the world today, maybe as opposed to when you were young, finishing seminary, and what do you think is significant that we should be paying attention to?
My own sense is that there is an undercurrent of despair and uncertainty that comes from two different and related sources. One is the fact that there are real threats to people's future. I mean, when I was growing up, we talked about nuclear war. Um, Nuclear war, though, has not gone away. It's just now people are worried, in addition to nuclear war, about climate change and about AI. Um, and so, first of all, there is real existential worry. And the second, which is related to that, is when I grew up, I think my parents' sense was that my life in its fundamentals would be similar to theirs. Could be better, could be worse. We'd have different technology, but it would be basically the same as theirs. I think for our children, there is a sense that there's no knowing what the world will look like in 10, 20, 40 years. And uncertainty is not a comfortable, constant situation for human beings about the fundamentals of their life. So I think those two, in addition to a constantly shifting political situation, which is partly a result of those two, makes life in many ways much more difficult than it was when I was growing up.
Well, it's a profound framing. And I think through that, we already have a sort of mini philosophical picture emerging, which is, right, an existential despair, which is a very deep philosophical, spiritual, but also, we know, psychological issue with knock-on effects for social behavior. And but related to that, you might say a more materially related sort of uncertainty about the geopolitical, economic stability of the world. Starting on that latter point, do you see any precedent in your knowledge of history for this degree of uncertainty about the continuity of global conditions? Or do you think there's actually something quite novel, not just we're in a generation that's getting hit by a lot of innovation, but if I may ask, do you think there's something even apocalyptic, you could say, about the times we're living in?
So I think that for certain parts of the world, there were certain periods, the Reformation, the Counter Reformation. I was just reading a historical novel from the 1950s called Man on a Donkey, which is about the period of the destruction of the monasteries in England. There were times when people thought, oh my God, my country is never going to be the same. But I don't think they globalized it the same way. I mean, when the agricultural revolution was happening, people on the other side of the world didn't know that there was this revolution happening on the different side of the world. The pandemic was probably the first time that the entire world was experiencing something, and all of the world knew that the entire world was experiencing something. So I think the despair is more universal, even though the particular human experience may be something that people have gone through in past times, people who were exiled from their country, who were in wartime, all of those things. But as a species, I think for human beings, this is new.
That is extraordinary, I think, insightful. It makes me think of something I've often argued, in the interpretation, for example, of Paul's writings in the New Testament, the tendency is either for people to deny that he believed in the so-called end of the world, or you get interpretations which favor a so-called belief in the literal end of the world, which then people say, well, that didn't happen. So obviously was wrong. And I'm often like, yeah, but what do you think the destruction of the temple means in the framework of where the temple is an image of creation? It's like, can't you acknowledge that if you believed prophetically that was going to happen, like we see the stories in Josephus, that that clearly constitutes the destruction of an epoch or of an aeon. And in a way, obviously, you could say many Christian interpretations may not see that. And so I've often thought worlds do end, right? You could say locally,
Right.
like you're saying in the Reformation, but the idea that you have a global consciousness of all of sort of the different worlds are now integrated, that is a striking thing. So, do you attribute any religious or spiritual significance to the globalized nature of our situation, the consciousness, and then the way that that apocalyptic expectation or fear or despair is not localized even to one community, but actually, even if one community is not feeling it acutely, they recognize, hey, some area of the world is literally going to go out of existence in our lifetime. The language is going to die. Is that special? Do you think,
I
as an
think that
expert?
it, I would say that it is in the sense that it requires a spiritual response. Um, what the causes of it may be, I'm less certain than Paul was, um, but but there is no doubt in my mind that it is fundamentally a spiritual crisis, and the sense of a lack of superintendence, or even, I mean, we live in a sort of Tower of Babel time where human beings are now arrogating to themselves the the ability to create and destroy on a scale that for most of human history was assumed to be a divine prerogative. And so when people talk about how we may create a new species, in quote, with AI, well, that's a terrifying prospect in a lot of ways. And I think without more than just a Western, but a universal spiritual response to that, um, we're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Yes, and that's connected to this is beautiful because I didn't know if we get to this, but my own work is concerned with science and religion, and my book I'm finishing is about posthumanism and how it comes out of our scientific and religious traditions. And you're touching on this, and so it makes me think of an incredible passage I'd wanted to discuss with you from Why Be Jewish, where you talk about the meaning of the image of God. And so I wonder if you would agree if this is maybe a way to think about how do we address this spiritual crisis. On the one hand, you point out first, the image of God isn't just as in many interpretations a specific faculty, even reason. You actually have this remarkable interpretation where you say it points to, in a sense, the divine uniqueness, the radical eternal individuality of each person. So being made in the image of God is not like a sort of communistic we're all the exact same. We're equal because we're in the divine image, but the divine image is the source of all of our radical novelty, individuality. And you say we're afraid of that, that we're actually, it's much easier, you say, to be, you say, indifference takes no energy, but living as though one does not matter is to forsake one's soul. And then on the other hand, you say, but we can then become very arrogant, and you could say maybe this is connected to the AI idea. We're going to create a new human species, right? We're the master and dominator of the earth and the human race. And for you, you have this incredible teaching, and I'd love if you could expand on this. You say it is a sin to be small in our own eyes, even if we cloak that smallness in a mantle of conceit. So could you maybe expand on that? How you would
So,
connect that to our spiritual crisis?
sure. This is actually a paraphrase of what Samuel says to Saul. Are you small in your own eyes? You're the king of Israel, and God has sent you on a journey. And the idea that, in fact, it is, Heschel used to say, the Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, the greatest sin is for a person to forget that he is a king. In other words, your humanity imposes certain responsibilities on you precisely because it grants you an enormous privilege. And when you think that people don't basically matter, um, you may start with yourself, but inevitably you transfer that to other people as well. And and it's both a terrifying and also not an unfamiliar thing in our world, which is that we, again, to go back to Heschel, he said this very beautifully in one of his books. He said, we both overestimate and underestimate ourselves. We underestimate ourselves by thinking we don't matter. How could God care about us? There are so many of us. And we overestimate ourselves in thinking we don't need anything outside of ourselves to get this right. And so the way that I think about it is that people who take themselves and their souls seriously, um, which doesn't mean necessarily, that they have to be humorless and dry and so on, but they're serious. Those people are more likely to take me and my soul seriously too. And so I feel as though they understand the fundamental human responsibility um, to one another. And I fear that in a time when human beings are devalued, in for some because they want to level human creation and all other creation. We're just another animal. There is nothing special about us. Uh, or we can create things that will replace us. And so what? It's just part of the evolution of the species, which is something I've also heard. Um, those are incredibly dangerous ideas, and they do not bode well for the future of humanity.
I agree, and the danger of them we see in a specific way in the resurgence of things that we might have thought would have been become, if not impossible, reduced. Like I often tell people, imagine that someone literally reintroduces into Congress chattel slavery as a bill. Most people today would be like, that's not possible, right? And you
Right.
can say that sense of social impossibilities, what I think you could say constitutes genuine local historical progress and morality. And at the same time, this is what I often try to explain to people when I speak about anti Semitism, coming from a background where I was raised Christian, and I try to help Christians understand you have a unique responsibility here, for good and for ill. Could you imagine this chattel slavery? And people be like, no, of course not. This is crazy. Then it's, why is Nazism, not just anti Semitism, actual neo Nazi movements have been growing for over a decade in Germany, in America, many of which in traditionally, horrifyingly traditional European religious apparent garb, or guys. And so I think the resurgence of anti Semitism after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, I do think personally, as a scholar and just analyst, is a clear indicator of some kind of utter catastrophe of the idea that we have been in some consistent form of moral progress. And so instead of just directly ask you about that now, though I think we're going to get to it, what I would like to start with about how to understand that is, how should people understand Judaism? Because I think many people have the idea that, well, Judaism is for Jews, and Jews are kind of a strange combination of like an ethnic religious category.
Right.
Not a Jew, you don't need to know anything about Judaism. Now, of course, I always tell people as a teacher, like when I taught at Yale, everyone needs to know everything in a sense about Judaism, just in the sense of to understand history. Christianity comes out of it, Islam comes out of these traditions. But, while that's a necessary educational work, even many Jewish people, I think, well, Judaism, I can know some about it. Maybe I do some of the mitzvah, but it's not something globally significant. Could you help us understand as a rabbi and as an expert, how should, say, the world, not just Jewish people, but like the global community, is there a need to understand Judaism? What should we as this global community all know about Judaism? I know you can't explain all of that like a
Right. But
curriculum.
I can at least pull on a couple of threads of that by saying that it's not enough to say, especially about Christianity, it's true of Islam too, but especially about Christianity, it's not enough to say Christianity came out of Judaism. Christianity largely defined itself in agreement with and opposition to Judaism throughout the ages, which makes perfect sense. That's what we do with our parents, right? We say, I'm going to follow this part of my parental teaching. I'm not going to follow that part. And this is why. And and again, this is for good and for ill. I mean, Christianity did some things that Judaism didn't do that we think of wonderful benefits to the West, like a separation of church and state for a lot of reasons, and other things, obviously, like hatred of Jews, that was a pushing away, and it was almost like a family quarrel when it started. And family quarrels are very ugly, uh, and they should never be enshrined forever and ever. But also, Judaism gave us many of the foundational ideas of the West. The idea that one God created human beings, that every person is in the image of God, and and in some ways, the way the great innovation of Judaism can be seen is if you look at other ancient faiths, or even just read the Odyssey or Greek plays, what the gods care about is how human beings treat them. If you treat the gods well or the gods like you, you're okay. The Ten Commandments start with that. You shall have no other gods before me. But then they move on to how you treat each other. And the idea that God cares about how human beings treat other human beings, this is an innovation that we all now don't see because we take it for granted. Um, and then the other part of the reason that it's important, I think, for people to understand Jews is they've been a universal people and a consequential people. That is, in almost every culture that Jews have been in, they have, in ways that are often very profound, influenced that culture. And to understand why that is and how Jews have that influence, and also why Jews were the identified other and how people treated them gives you tremendous insights into human nature. So there are a lot of reasons. It's one of those questions that is, multi-determined, but especially for people in the West and the Western world, you cannot learn Western history without knowing something of the Jews.
Yeah, that's, I think, a beautifully helpful framework, and it covers so many of the logical categories that extend beyond my original question. And it's connected to, part of how we met is you were speaking at a wonderful event at Shabtai at Yale, with a philosopher there as well, Paul Franks. And I was very moved by your comments about anti-Semitism, but more broadly about the beauty of Judaism and the kind of calling of our time. And at the Marginalia, I direct the Center for Jewish-Christian Relations, which is based partly on my own original research about the Christian origins of anti-Semitism. And one of the challenges there is, of course, as you point out, no one really likes to be told you have an ugly part of your tradition. But you said it's like this kind of family hatred to the parent, which is, can be described in so many ways, I think is a real problem. Like, I've been concerned, like I've asked Catholic friends, why are not Catholic bishops condemning people like Fuentes?
Right.
In theory, they should. You would think, because of doctrines like Nostra Aetate or documents like this. So maybe before we go further, we could talk a bit about this specific issue. I'm sure you've been involved in dialogue, across all religious traditions. I'm sure much of your career was there a message specifically to Christians that you would like to help them understand? We published the scholarly work where I tell Christians, look, yeah, of course, focus on the good things in your tradition, but understand anti-Semitism is not, it's not even contingently related to Christianity. Yes, you can look at forms of hatred by the
Right.
Egyptians. It's not the same thing. Germany was a Christian nation. The currents of anti-Semitism that led all the other European countries and America to not take, in many cases, any Jewish refugees were a part of what people would call Christian civilization. And so I think we have this moment where I think there's a necessary reckoning. You're pointing out Judaism underlies the values we treasure in the West.
Yeah.
And there's a movement today to reclaim Western civilization. And I'm like, okay, fine, but we need to accept Western civilization as anti-Semitism baked into it. So how can we understand, say, the Christian part of our civilizational tradition in a way that's going to be good for the Jews?
Um, it's a profound question, and I I'm not sure that this is an adequate answer, but at least part of the answer is to recognize that the the theological break from Judaism was necessary to create Christianity, obviously, but that the rejection of Judaism, although really important at the inception of Christianity, is really no longer theologically important. That is, you can be a devoted, loving Christian and have a positive attitude towards Jews and Judaism, and it no longer impairs your Christianity. I mean, that went out with the Marcion heresy. That's very old. And it's now more of a reflex than a theological necessity. You actually can love Jews and love Judaism and love Israel and be a perfectly upright, as many Christians around the world are, and devoted Christian, and think the Jewish people must have some role, or they wouldn't be around for thousands of years, and God must intend them to be around, and still believe in the divinity of Jesus. I understand, and I think anyone could understand how, at the inception of Christianity, many identity formations are the way you know you're you is by saying, I'm not that. And so there was a lot of not that required at the inception, but it's no longer required and hasn't been for probably 1,500 years. And I think that Christianity has to learn to be itself without, as again, as many Christians are. Nostra Aetate was a huge step in that direction, um, to be Christian without being not Jewish. And I think the same thing is true of the Muslim tradition, although in different ways. And there are all sorts of complications that don't exist now with the Christian world. Um, but that's not something that is going to be immediately understandable to many Christians, and rather has to be absorbed and preached in certain ways by Christian leaders. That's the only way it will become the common currency of Christians in the world.
Yes, and that's a profound answer to what I know is a difficult and deep question. And I think that's part of our work, is to try to represent at least the scholarly resources and to bring experts like yourself to address this, because I've often been, I'll be perfectly frank, I've been distressed at my efforts to sometimes get the interest of Christian leaders and to think about how strategically do we do this, because I think you're exactly right. It has to come in a sense from the pulpit, from the church, and that can seem like a specifically religious mission, and yet, as you're pointing out, it's actually, I think, a matter of doing historical justice. And I would go even farther, as a person who's, has a kind of expertise in Christian theology. I think Christians are obligated to honor the Jews, and I often tell people, just imagine a world in which Christianity, instead of being something that is indifferent to anti-Semitism, or worse, passively or actively fomenting it. Imagine if every Christian, or in every Christian institution, is just de facto loves their Jewish neighbors, is always standing up for them. We would eliminate anti-Semitism, like, basically overnight.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that that's true.
and I think it would have consequential knock-on effects for how the Islamic tradition could think about it, because it's the third of these iterations, and I think you have to deal with the original sort of child-parent problem, you might say, first. And so I think that influence of the sort of antagonism is, as you say, it's no longer necessary. And I would go farther and say, yeah, it's not only no longer necessary, it should be reversed. If you're a Christian and you really believe Jesus was Jewish, and you really think he's the Messiah, one, why don't you ask Jews what the Messiah means? They might give you an
Right.
education. You can get a deeper understanding, but it should certainly mean you bless Abraham, right? You bless Abraham's descendants. And so I personally want to argue that the anti-Semitism should be understood as an essential heresy of Christianity, right? That to be a messianic person who thinks you have access to the one God of Israel through a savior prophet figure would mean you should love the people of Israel, the Jewish people. Like, in principle, you should be devoted to their well-being. You should take the Abrahamic covenant seriously. Who blesses Abraham will be blessed, who curses Abraham will be cursed. Because I see in that sense that Christian tradition should become, I hope, a reversal of what it's been through history. And,
And
and
and I really do believe that there are a lot of Christians who feel that way. Look, I mean, one of the things that as a Jew I am enormously grateful for is how much Christianity is not what Christianity was 200 years ago, and I think that that's beautiful. As you say, now there is this very crude resurgence of anti-Semitism, especially online, and some of it is real, and some of it is, ginned up by bots and others who have different agendas. They don't really care one way or the other about theological issues. But but yes, if the Christian world were to rise as one, I think that that would have in, indescribable beneficial effects, not only for Jews but for society.
And this then connects us to the deeper positive question we were pursuing with you about, spirituality as a response to this crisis. Because I mean, what would you say to the idea that I think the why the Jew, this is just one theory, as you mentioned in your books, there's so many, infinite reasons you could say, or no reasons for Jew hatred. But I think in the Christian story, I read it as the Jew, I think of as the archetypal actual human. And so I perceive anti-Semitism as a kind of self-hatred of the human species, like an inability to come to terms with its dependence on its history, its dependence on God, its dependence on its parents. Very similar to the way, and it's crude, but adolescents, as you said, go through a separation process, which because of the psychological nascence of the young
Right.
person, it requires a quite oppositional a psyche. But as soon as the psyche matures, the measure of that maturation is reconciliation and a deeper form of respect and appreciation.
Just
And
so.
so spiritually, that would mean a kind of global revolution. And since we have a global despair, and you say if Christians could, as a in one group, change their view about the Jews to what it ought to be, which is a deep reverence for appreciation, respect. Not that you have to agree about politics of Israel or anything, but just of course we should
Right.
defend Jewish life. Can you help us walk us through how maybe the Jewish tradition's understanding of the royalty of the soul? Because I'll be honest, this was not something I ever understood as a Christian. The idea of this kind of internal malchut or dignity. This is something I've come to learn as a philosopher, scholar of religion, really uniquely from the Jewish tradition. And it's something I love about your teaching and your work, this profound sense of dynamic adaptability and dignity with a very rooted sense of coherence to tradition. So tell us more, if you could, about what do we need to know about ourselves as
So,
human beings?
so I think it's really significant, and thank you, by the way, for so much that you're saying that really is just so beautiful for somebody in the Jewish tradition to hear. I think if you look at the first two statements about the human being in the Bible, they're sort of on balance, all of it. The first one is, of course, that we're created in the image of God. And the second, which is the first statement about human character in the Bible, which was noticed, as far as I know, it was first explicitly noticed by Milton, actually, which is that the first statement about human character in the Bible is, it is not good for a man to be alone. And so at the same time, the Bible affirms the dignity of the human being and the sociability of the human being. That is, you may be a king, but you shouldn't be a king by yourself. And I think that the Jewish tradition is an attempt, in some ways, to spin out those two comments. That is, it's a very communal tradition. It's a very group tradition. Um, but it really does see the human being as being a reflection of the divine. And what you said earlier about how we are infinite instantiations of God is something actually that is said in the Mishnah, which is a human king mints coins and they all look the same. The divine king mints human beings, and every face is different. And
That's
that
beautiful.
notion that we're all like a little spark of the infinite divine, if people really believed that and could act that way, I mean, we'll all fail, we'll all get upset, we'll all get anxious, we'll all get angry. But if you kept that idea in mind day to day, it would profoundly revolutionize the way we acted with one another. And so I do think that it's an incredibly powerful. I do also, as long as we're on this subject, I want to tell you a story
Please.
about how much, because some of your listeners may not actually appreciate how much Christianity has changed. And that actually is also good to hear. So I had a teacher when I was in rabbinical school named Eliezer Shlomovich, who's a wonderful human being. I don't want, I could spend the rest of the time praising his wisdom, his knowledge, and so on. And this came from Eastern Europe. But his experience of Christianity was horrible. And he was taught literally, like, you shouldn't look at a church. When you pass a church, you should spit on the ground because you know that they all want to kill you. And he went through labor camps. His wife went through the Holocaust. He lost much of his family in the Holocaust. He comes to the United States. He goes to teach at what was then called the University of Judaism in Los Angeles. And the president of the university says, there's an interfaith conference up in Berkeley. I'd like you to be our representative. And he said, no, I'm not going to meet with Christians. And the president said, no, you don't understand that. I phrased it as a request, but this is not a request. There's an interfaith conference and you will be our representative. So he goes. And the priest who was leading the conference at the opening meal said, I would like to open this meal the way our Lord Jesus Christ would have opened the meal. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz, the Hebrew blessing for bread. And Eliezer said he started to cry because he did not know that the world could be that way. And in that sense, I mean, the blessing of coexistence of different traditions, especially in America, is revolutionary in the way I don't think most Americans even realize it's revolutionary. And so the dialogue we're having really has enormous healing potential for a history in which there was so much hostility and so much hatred and so much estrangement that we can't afford anymore in the world in which we live to carry into the future.
That is a really beautiful story, Rabbi Wolpe. I so appreciate that. And I wonder if just to, in a way, add another layer to it again, for people who may not be aware, because I remember I've heard another rabbi who said he went to a Christian seminary class and he was asked to speak about the Jewish perception of Christianity. And he said, I'm going to say a lot of nice things, but I have to be honest and say the first thing is we're afraid of you. And I think,
Right,
honestly,
right.
so many Christians do not understand this, and I know they don't. Or I think they would be so much more compassionate and active on combating anti-Semitism. They do not understand this, how recent and relevant, alas, this fear is. And yet, as we're moving through America and through this process, I think in order to cut to the root of how we can get people to appreciate their own traditions, whether it's Christian or any other tradition, in a richer way, how I think underlying a lot of the misunderstandings of Judaism is, of course, ignorance, but it's also, I think, it is a sense perhaps of despair. For example, so much of the resentment of Jews comes from, obviously, I think it's a kind of a perverted form of marveling. You see a tiny group of people who have been, obviously, in every literal sense. I always point out to people, do you have any idea how recent it is that Jews have been legal equals in any society? I mean, it is less than 200 years.
Right.
They've been and the resentment of Jews and so much secular, sort of ridiculous anti-Semitism, protocols of the elders of Zion type nonsense, is because of Jewish power, which is a resentful way of recognizing Jewish accomplishment, or Jewish creativity, which is a resentful way of acknowledging something beautiful about the Jewish tradition's love of education, of individuality. And so how, if a person has a lot of maybe unconscious even resentment, which I think is rooted to that despair, is there any general counsel you would give anyone about, look, if you have a sense of despair or resentment, here's some just things that might help you come to a deeper ability to appreciate other people, appreciate the beauties of your life, rather than think, because I don't have this, or because I don't know why they have this, I'm going to hate them.
So I would say two things, one about Jews and one in general. About Jews, first of all, as you know, very few people actually realize how few Jews there are in the world. When you ask people, what percentage of America is Jewish, and they find out that it's less than 2%, and of the world less than 0.2%, they're astonished. And the problem in part is that Jews are significant enough that it makes sense to attack them, but they're small enough that it's never dangerous to attack them. I mean, you can imagine if somebody were to attack all Christians, that would be dangerous because so many Christians. Or attack all Muslims, that's dangerous, so many Muslims. But to attack Jews, you're fairly safe. And the despair that people feel is not generally the despair because someone else did something to them. It is generally, there are two causes often of the despair of our life. One is circumstances that are much larger than one group of people or one politician, or they're much larger. I always, when people say that that this leader is responsible for all the bad things, the question is, well, what about the currents that allow this leader or that leader to flourish and to to do all the things that he or she does. You have to ask yourself about that. But also, people make happy and successful lives in almost every kind of circumstance in this world. And all you have to do, as I've done, is have the opportunity to travel to a place where there is real poverty, to Haiti, to India, to other places, and you will find out that actually so much of your life is how you view your life as opposed to the circumstances of your life. And in this sense, again, I think that the internet does us a great disservice because it's always telling us how we should live and how we should feel and what we should aspire to. I just wrote this morning, actually, that as I get older, the things that I hate most are all these articles telling me how I should be younger. You should do this and you won't feel your age. You should do that and your biological age will be younger, as though like growing older is such a crime that you shouldn't do that and you should do everything you can to reverse. Well, I want to grow older if that's okay with you. Um, but to resist that, to resist the constant pictures of how perfect everyone's life is except for yours and how wealthy everybody is except for you, you have to again have a sort of stiffening of the spiritual spine. The Jews did not take away your good world, right? There were people who have suffered and people who have done well in every country in the world, in every age of the world. And there haven't been Jews in every country in every age. That's just life. And so, yes, it is always easier to blame someone else. The trick is, of course, it doesn't change your situation. In fact, in the end, it makes it worse. So, both as both for your own sense and also for the good of the world, um, take responsibility for the conditions of your life.
Yeah, a very needed message. And that the message implying it's not, this happens beyond the Jewish community. There's people suffer
Of
and they
course,
find a way to
yes,
prosper. And to me, as a philosopher, my public philosophy work is called the Becoming Human Project because I think life is a project. We don't start off
great,
knowing what
yep.
we are. And so what you're saying implies there's a way of life. There's a way of life that isn't unique to just the Jewish tradition, that if you find that way, you can prosper. Obviously, I
So
think we
I,
would agree it's wisdom. So could you tell us
yeah,
about what is that way of
I was going to say, I wrote a book years ago called Making Loss Matter because I thought we spend a lot of time, especially in theology, talking about why bad things happen. But it's so much more important to figure out what do you do when bad things happen. Because inevitably bad things will happen to you, and arriving at an explanation won't make them better. But you have to learn how to take the losses of your life and not make it so that in the end they're good. They may always be bad, but still you will have made the world better and yourself better because it happened. That doesn't mean it's good that it happened. It means that given that it's happened, you now must do something with it that actually make the world better. And that's part of becoming human.
well, and so is there, if someone has a specific, say, recent bad thing, is there any paths you could say concretely how they could begin to, and I really appreciate that. You're not saying it's good, you're not saying it necessarily ever will make it good, but you can somehow make a good from it. How can people learn to do that?
So the first thing that you do is reach out to other people who have had the same tragedy. One of the things that I saw in being the rabbi of a congregation was someone, for example, would undergo the worst tragedy, which is losing a child. And they would say to me, nothing good will ever come out of this. And then a year later, another parent would lose a child and they would say, I can talk to them and tell them how to get through it. And the reason they could was because they'd gone through it. So I've had a brain tumor and I had lymphoma. And I'm not glad I went through it, but it made me a better rabbi principally because the main contribution was when I walked into a hospital room, the people in that hospital bed said to me almost always, oh, well, you know what this is. You've gone through this. I'll listen to you because you're not coming in here as somebody who never had a sickness or was never, in this bed the way I am. And so in some ways, the human, race is a great tribe of pain. And when you join that tribe, you discover that one of the blessings is that you can talk to people and understand them in a new way.
So that's very profound. And I wonder for you and your understanding of the divine, you mentioned in your work, God in Judaism is both the sovereign creator of everything, but also extremely involved in a relationship. Human people is God. Does God suffer? I know there's a. I don't know what you think about it,
Yeah,
but I know there's traditions of Shekinah, for
there are
example, going into
traditions.
exile. So, can you talk to us
Right.
about? Do you think God knows our suffering in that way?
So I'm one of those over time. My first book was called The Healer of Shattered Hearts, A Jewish View of God. And it spoke about God in very anthropomorphic ways, in very human-like ways. Um, as I've gotten older, I have recognized what I say sometimes to high school students is when you were 2, could you imagine what it is to be a high school student? And they say, no, of course not. And I say, not only could you not imagine, but you can't even imagine what it is you can't imagine. Now, God in relation to us is more distant than we are to 2-year-olds. So when I say things about God, I always preface it by saying, look, I'm just talking human, but I don't really know what it is, obviously, to be God. And in that sense, yes, the tradition says that God is pained by human pain. That's not, that's not what God wants for us. And all these words, of course, are human words for something that is infinitely greater than anything we can imagine. Um, and so I do feel that, although I don't even know what it could mean.
So then you wouldn't, there's of course a tradition of which in the Jewish form, Maimonides is the most famous exponent. There's many forms of it in Islamic and Christian theology where the philosopher is going to say, yeah, but this is really just anthropomorphic language. God doesn't really suffer. If I can push you just a tiny bit, are you saying you kind of actually, because what you're saying is almost the opposite, that God's suffering is
Uh,
something actually we can't comprehend. It's because it would be in some way commensurate to incommensurate infinity.
right. I'm saying I don't know,
Okay.
but I do know. What I do know is that the Bible and the rabbis speak of God as suffering. Imo anochi b'tzara, it says in the Psalm, I am with you in your suffering. So all I can say is I don't think that I'm wiser than the Bible and the rabbis. And if they say that God suffers, I'm gonna use that as a powerful understanding of God's nature, but it's an understanding of something that is ultimately beyond my understanding. So in that sense, I almost end up with yes, but I don't know,
Well, that's
which
very
is
that's a beautifully
but
humble response.
yeah,
So just last 2 minutes, I guess at the end of the time, I ask you about the end of the time. Do you think this could be a whole nother conversation I'd love to have with you, but
right.
do you think we're in an age that is something like the end of the sixth day or the messianic age?
So I have a little bit of a skeptical view of the end time only because I know how many times human beings have been convinced they were in the end time and they were always wrong. Um, and so what I say is something that I believe I first heard expressed by Miguel de Unamuno, who was a Spanish Catholic philosopher, existentialist philosopher, brilliant, brilliant writer.
Love his work.
And he said the whole point is to not to worry about what happens after this world, but to live in such a way that you deserve that something beautiful happens after this world. So I think our job is not to know whether this is the end time, but to live in such a way that we deserve a better time than we have now. And that's all we can do. And then if this actually is the end time, we will know. But I suspect this drama is going to go on at least for the duration of my life.
Well, I don't think there could be a more beautiful poetic ending for our time together. So I'm gonna thank you so much for sharing your
Thank you.
wisdom and your time and for being part of Marginalia and our project to help educate people about the wonderful wisdom of the Jewish
Thank you.
tradition.
Love Marginalia, and it was a delight to be with you.
Uh, Thank you so much, Rabbi Wolpe. That was
Okay.
wonderful. Really,
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I
yeah.
really, really enjoyed it.